Well, thank you all. Great to be here. We are acutely aware that we are the last thing between you guys and dinner, which is not a safe place for any panel to be. But we have a terrific combination here in Ann Neuberger, dear friend from many years, who just left the job of Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies, and Julian King, Sir Julian King, who tells me he was the last British European commissioner, but that was like a self-own for Britain, right? You could have gone on if they had just voted differently, I guess. Yeah, right. And we're going to explore a little bit. I'm sure they'll take another vote soon. Pardon me. We're going to explore a little bit where we think the broad direction of cyber policy is going to go. And you spent years at the National Security Agency. You then came to the White House for a job that had not existed prior to the time that you held it. And unfortunately, I don't think they are continuing quite in that same role. But during that time, you were constantly engaged in this debate between how much you use offensive cyber and how much you build up your defenses and your resilience, mostly your resilience. We now have a new administration that hasn't said a whole lot about cyber, but what they have said has been consistent, which is that they believe the Biden administration underused offensive tools, that they plan to go use them to regain deterrence by getting out much more aggressively. They haven't answered the and then what question, which is, what do you do when somebody comes back in and starts throwing rocks at the glassiest house? So I'm wondering if you could just explore a little bit about what the theory of the case was about how aggressively the Biden administration used offensive cyber, and what you think about what you're hearing, what questions it raises.
Absolutely. So first, it's great to be here, and I must say that looking at the agenda for the conference, it was remarkable to see the number of thoughtful speakers and talks. It's really great to see. So a shout out to the organizers for putting together such a clearly impactful conference. I think to your question, David, the first thing I would say is in the larger geopolitical competition plays out in cyberspace. It's no surprise that the evening before Russia invaded Ukraine, they conducted a cyber attack on a satellite company providing Ukraine's military communications, right? A traditional kinetic war began with a cyber attack to disable a key part of military capabilities. As we look at cyberspace, it's one continuum, defense and offense. And I think that what we've seen is a rise in the number of actors, countries and criminals conducting offensive activity in cyberspace, and a sense that all the hard work done on resilience, on better intelligence sharing between government and the private sector, and the problem is just getting harder. So there's certainly a sense to say, how do we ensure we're bringing every tool to the game? And how do we make it riskier, costlier, and harder for attackers? And I think reflecting on experience both in the intelligence community and in the White House. I've had the opportunity to lead both defensive and offensive operations. And I would say, first, fundamentally, work on defense and on resilience is a precursor, as you just said, to any offensive operation. Because if somebody's briefing the president on a set of efforts to disable an adversary's ability to conduct a cyber attack, the first question will be, what's the risk of blowback? And the ability to answer that, one needs to know what is the defensive posture, how resilient is a pipeline, a port, a military's communication. So that's the first piece. So the work done on defense fundamentally enables being able to use offense as a tool. And then in thinking about where offense plays, I think it's important to begin with the end in mind with regard to what are the goals. Is the goal deterrence, making clear that a country can respond and cause impact as well? Is the goal signaling as part of a larger conflict or crisis to say, hey, step away from that? Or is the goal practical, tactical, disabling, e.g. stealing an adversary's cyber capabilities with the goal of enabling defenses against that? And I think when one begins with the end in mind, that then determines how achievable is it? Is offense set of the right tool as part of a broader package of things? And how do you bring along the right foreign partners, because cyberspace is global, in order to be effective?
So tell us, if you can, Julian, how this plays out within the British government. I mean, Britain doesn't talk about it as much, but is one of the most skillful of the offensive cyber players. Obviously, within the Five Eyes, they've got a lot of responsibility for Russia, so they have a lot of opportunity there. And yet, difficult as it has been, and I've tried, to get officials to talk about offensive cyber as a strategy back through the Bush administration and the Obama administration and so forth, it's even harder in Britain. And what I worry about with that is that this debate that Anne has just alluded to, which takes place every week in some form or another inside, doesn't get played out quite as much in Britain, and certainly in other European capitals. Britain, at least you have the sense it's happening behind closed doors. I'm not sure it does elsewhere.
But we're notoriously shy, as you
Yes.
know. So this discussion is set up as a discussion about transatlantic cooperation,
Right.
and in some areas possibly some difference in perspectives across the Atlantic. And
Have you seen any of those lately?
And we might come on to that, I guess. And I guess I'm here as the sacrificial European, even though I'm a Brit. Brits can be Europeans. Brits can be Europeans too. And at the European level, when the Europeans are thinking about these things, as they've done over the last 10 years, they are inspired by the experience of some of the individual member states. And for a period, while the Brits were still in, they were inspired concretely on cyber security by the British experience. Indeed, the first EU cybersecurity strategy that some of the people here were involved in drawing up was to a large extent inspired by British experience. So you're right that there are some countries in Europe who have got deeper roots on this than others, but there's been a conscious effort over recent years to try and share that experience and become more serious about cybersecurity. But you're also right that on the whole, that is the defense side rather than the offense potential. There's an enormous amount of work that's been done collectively in Europe to try and build resilience, reduce dependencies, do the economic security side of cybersecurity. And that's going ahead under the new Commission as well. They've got a new cybersecurity strategy coming out focused on defending some bits of critical infrastructure like the health sector, for example, dealing with some of the physical infrastructure like undersea cables, etc., dealing with some of the societal resilience challenges. There's something called the Democracy Shield, which is going to attempt to get better at dealing with attempts at interference and deliberate spreading of dis and misinformation. That is work in hand, and it's discussed. There isn't an open discussion because there isn't an enormous amount of collective work on the offensive side.
And one thing that you and I spent the last 2 years of your time in office talking a lot about in the Chinese territory, but obviously spilled to Britain as well, were Volt Typhoon and Sol Typhoon. Volt being the attack on infrastructure, the code placed in utility grids and pipelines and so forth, and Sol Typhoon being this incredibly carefully designed entry into the telecom networks, which we think went well beyond the United States. Tell us a little bit about what your experience was dealing with those, particularly with your European partners. How aware were they? When I give a talk and I mention Sol Typhoon to an American audience, I'm probably lucky if 5 out of 100 people have heard of it before. I suspect the numbers would probably be lower in Europe.
You know, it's a really interesting question. One thing I would note is that Chinese pre-positioning in U.S. critical infrastructure, as represented by both of those activities, really moved the U.S. closer to the European model, in that beginning in late 2021, the U.S. began putting in place mandatory cyber requirements for the small set of companies that operate the most critical infrastructure: ports, airports, rail, water, medical data. And that was really taking a page from the Europeans' book, and in this I include the UK, in a recognition that the voluntary model was inadequate to the sophistication and the scale of the threat, and that for the set of critical companies who, if disable the American economy, the American ability to operate, there had to be a government requirement to do the minimums: monitor the network, patch the network promptly, etc. And indeed, I would note that after the US discovered the significant Chinese compromise of US telecoms, I actually called my British colleague, because the Brits had moved out and put in place mandated requirements for cybersecurity of telecoms several years before. And my question was, how effective would your regulations have been against this set of activity, right? We were trying...
And had this set of activity actually shown up in Britain as well?
I won't speak to that, because I don't know that that's been spoken to publicly. But the question was, and by the answer, that might actually answer you, and the answer was, and we would have discovered it far faster, and we would have contained it far faster. And I think, that's the question we have to ask ourselves: are we making progress against an attacker? So to that vein, we actually got closer because of that activity to the European approach. On the other side, you asked the question of when we talk to our European colleagues. I think in some ways, and I say this with deep affection as the child of a European, Europe is behind the US in bringing together the intelligence community, the cyber defender community, the law enforcement community, to fight one fight on cyber. Those communities, I think, are coming together. They're still a bit behind where the US has been today, I think partially driven by the activity of China, the activity of Russia, in cyberspace.
So, Julian, this takes us to how one defines regulation in this space, because what Anne is just describing that the U.S. adopted based on the European model, to people in this room would be good cybersecurity practice, mandate some minimum standards. We make people put airbags in cars. We can make them have minimum standards here. What I've learned in 3 weeks in covering the Trump administration is they want regulation gone, by and large. They particularly want it gone in Europe for American companies. They particularly are backed in this by Silicon Valley, with this range of tech executives who once gave heavily to Democrats and this year gave pretty heavily to President Trump, and then paid for a good deal of the inauguration along the way. And on Monday, I was with Vice President Vance when he spoke to the AI summit and basically said, if you guys are choking yourselves to death with your regulatory setup, and somehow they're going to have to balance the benefits that Anne just described with what I didn't think was an unreasonable critique from Vance.
So the Europeans and their American allies can and have worked very effectively at tackling some of these challenges. And actually, it's a kind of a virtuous circle. They learn from each other. And indeed, under the last Trump administration, Trump and Pompeo in particular put a lot of pressure on the Europeans to get a bit more serious about China, and in particular Huawei and 5G. And I think that probably from their perspective, the Europeans were a little bit slow to respond, but respond they did nevertheless. And I was involved with some other people who are here in setting up a series of tests where the Europeans tested themselves on how resilient their infrastructure was, and then came up with various methods for dealing with weaknesses, including, in many countries, mandating the removal of Chinese tech from their 5G networks, even if it's been a bit slow in its implementation in some countries. That was a response to a dialogue that was taking place between the Trump administration and European administrations.
Well, that dialogue
at the time.
began, as I recall, with Mr. Pompeo's threats to withhold intelligence from any country that didn't go his way.
It was a multifaceted dialogue that produced those results. I think the question now has to be whether the dialogue that you're suggesting is about to take place with the new Trump administration is going to yield the same ultimately positive outcome from the Europeans. And I think that is, after 3 weeks, that remains an open question. There are some areas where I think there can be a really thorough discussion, like what do you mean by deregulation in these spheres, including AI and the governance, including content moderation in some platforms. And I think that conversation will happen, and I think it can be productive. There are other questions where it feels a little bit more like just scrap your approach to how you think about regulating business, particularly if it's a US business, that frankly are going to be a bit more difficult. It was easier for the Europeans and the US to work out how they were going to be tougher on China than it will be for the Europeans to respond to overt pressure from the US to give US companies a free pass.
So, Anne, what does your experience tell you about this? We really got two different problems here, it strikes me. On the cybersecurity side, you have just what you described, which is we had things to go learn from what they were mandating. And one of the big lessons I think I came out of from your work in the Biden administration is you can talk about public-private partnerships till you have got the last person in the conference room standing. But
Not what we're going to do tonight.
that's right. Well, we haven't decided yet. But the fact of the matter is, if you don't do some mandates, it's not going to happen.
No.
And I was pretty shocked at the degree to which we discovered the telecom companies were pretty wide open as we dug deeper into the Salt Typhoon stuff. AI is a different challenge where the concern is that the regulation is going to hold back your innovation, which is a different issue. There's certainly an overlap.
To your point, I think when we look at AI, there's real lessons to be learned from cybersecurity. And I think there's sobering lessons to be learned in that today, across Europe, in the United States, around the world, we're operating on digital infrastructure that's not secure enough for what relies on it. Whether that's our power generation, whether that's children's records at school, whether that's hospital operations. And working to bolt on cybersecurity afterwards and resilience is far harder, right? So I think as we look at AI, and particularly as we look at the role of AI in sensitive parts of our economy or our infrastructure, right? For example, one can see the value of AI models generating the load balancing information for energy generation in a given region, right? Based on historic consumption, based on upcoming consumption, based on weather predictions. One can see the value in that. Wouldn't we want to consider in advance transparency on what data that model is trained on, tests to ensure that it's a safe model, an understanding of the infrastructure, and frankly, where it might be generating an answer that's outside norms, so you have a human in the loop who looks at it. Those are pretty common sense kind of practices that you're talking about innovation, you see the value in application, and you're saying, how do we ensure we do this safely? And I think that's a key goal of our approach to AI. I must admit, when we hear the larger discussions of, will there be AGI, et cetera, there are applications of AI. So as part of, the White House had tasked a review of different sectors where AI was being used and where AI was predicted to be used. And there's some really promising areas, drug discovery for one. You can see where responsible innovation would mean having the drug regulator at the FDA say, okay, I believe the statistic is 1 in 60 drugs, I think I may have that wrong, but it's a very small number succeed in getting through clinical trials. Clearly we want more effective drugs and more drugs for narrow illnesses. It would help to have AI-generated simulation of that. How does the regulator be a partner in ensuring we're fully leveraging AI for that? And I think challenging our system to come up with a working, responsible model, we can do that together across the transatlantic. I think it's shifting from the theory to the practical application in economic areas, in, frankly, military or intelligence cooperation. So, for example, when you think about language models, AI is game-changing in language in the intelligence community. For example, for narrow languages where you don't have a lot of speakers, or in helping determine patterns of slang or words that might be used to cover for something that's being planned. One could see where building those models together with key partners would be a valuable thing to do. Doing so in a way that's done responsibly is in all of our interests.
I was struck, Julian, I thought the speech that the Vice President gave was very interesting, and the fact that they've got a somewhat tech-savvy, spent time in the industry Vice President to go give that was helpful. The absence of any discussion of guardrails was pretty striking. If you've been listening to these speeches for as long as I have, you know, usually there's that paragraph saying, of course, we need to design these with the guardrails to make sure that in promoting AI, we are not aiding a terrorist in building a nuclear weapon or chemical or biological or whatever. That was gone. That was missing. There was a long discussion of European regulation. So I guess my question is, what is the strategy that the Europeans use to draw the Trump team back in the middle here? Or is there nothing that will draw them back in the middle here?
You're asking me that?
Yes. As a European, or the sacrificial lamb for Europeans.
Okay, so I agree 100% with a practical approach to this, where if you want to find things that you work on together, you can. And I, being an optimist, think that there is quite a good chance that over time we will get there and we will be having that kind of discussion. Possibly starting with some of the countries who are most involved in this, but building to a discussion between the Europeans and the US administration, because whether you like it or not, quite a lot of the regulation, good or bad, is done at the European level. So you need a European level to this discussion. But that isn't where we are today. That isn't where we are after 3 weeks, or indeed where we are after the Vice President's speech and rapid departure from the AI conference. Where we are today is...
He's got another one tomorrow. We can see whether he can leave.
So, and I'd be amiss, if I didn't say this here, because you'll certainly hear it more over the next 48 hours. But at the moment, you've got a set of European interlocutors who feel discombobulated by the new US administration, even if they want to have a goodwill and reach out. But they feel that the combination of Ukraine, tariffs, Greenland, Gaza, and an approach on AI which says all European regulation is bad, is very difficult to engage with. So my shorter answer to you is find a different pitch.
And we just have a minute left here, but so you can, we'll ask you to defend the Trump administration. No, here's what I was going to actually ask you. Had you had another year to 18 months in your job, what do you think would have been the most urgent things you could have gotten done?
I think in a couple of areas I would talk about. One is actually doing the practical work on AI as we talk about, both within the economic perspective, sectors where it's the most promising and there's common good. Think about, for example, the US and Europe both have development programs, for parts of the world where there aren't enough doctors, where there's hard to diagnose diseases. Think about deploying computer vision models to fight particular illnesses that deal with premature blindness in parts of Africa, right? So really adjusting our development programs to, in those areas where AI can be a force for good, working with the private sector. And I would note a shout out to companies like Google and Microsoft have been doing work like that. AI for good, have actual efforts stood up. So that would be one thing. And doing the practical work on responsible innovation in the most promising sectors. And doing it together. That includes, I mentioned, drug discovery, quantum error correction, even in an intelligence perspective. One of the things that worries me the most in the competition between democracies and authoritarian governments like China is that we're playing a different game. China has millions of cameras around the world on which it trains its computer vision facial recognition models. It doesn't protect the civil liberties and privacy of its citizens. It can deploy those faster. We as democracies need to ensure that we can protect ourselves from that risk and that we are also using promising technologies for our own national security mission in a responsible way, in a transparent way that has the buy-in of our citizens and the buy-in of our partners. There's real work to be done in that space, and it's practical work, it's on-the-ground work by experts leveraging trusted relationships. So that would be one really focus area that I think is timely.
Well, we could carry on with this for some time, but we would make everybody late to dinner, and that would make us the least popular 3 people in this room. So I want to thank you all on the panel. I want to thank you all for what's been a really interesting day here.
Thanks, David.